The stone walls of the castle felt thick and ancient under the weight of the night. High above the valley, the fortress sat like a silent crown upon the ridge. The air inside the corridors was thin and smelled of wood smoke and damp limestone. Every few paces, a torch burned in an iron bracket. The flames did not roar. They hissed softly, consuming the oil and throwing long, dancing shadows against the grey masonry. Inside the royal chambers, Queen Ilara lay beneath layers of heavy wool and embroidered silk. Her room was a sanctuary of stillness. The windows were narrow and covered with thick tapestries to keep out the biting autumn wind. A single candle flickered on a small wooden stand near her bed. The light was weak. It barely reached the edges of the room. It illuminated the steady rise and fall of her chest. She was deep in a sleep that had no dreams. Beyond the heavy oak door of her bedroom, the castle was not at rest. In the lower galleries, the movement of men was deliberate and hushed. Boots with soft leather soles clicked against the flagstones. There was no clanking of metal. There was no shouting of orders. Groups of noblemen moved in clusters of 3 or 4. They wore heavy cloaks to hide their finery. Their faces were tight with a mixture of fear and resolve. They met in the alcoves where the light was dim. They spoke in vibrations rather than words. Their hands rested on the hilts of their daggers, not for aggression, but for comfort. The tension in the air was a physical presence. It was the feeling of a bowstring drawn to its limit. Lord Valerius stood at the top of the spiral staircase. He was a man of many years and even more secrets. He watched the courtyard through a narrow arrow slit. Below, the torches of the perimeter guards moved in predictable patterns. But the patterns were breaking. A guard at the western gate leaned his spear against the wall and sat down. He did not look for intruders. He looked at the ground. Another guard. The armory turned his back to the door and began to walk away from his post. The loyalty of the castle was dissolving like salt in rain. Deep in the kitchens, the fires had been banked for the night. The large copper pots hung silent from the rafters. A young servant girl sat on a stool near the back exit. She held a small bundle of belongings in her lap. She was waiting for a signal that had not yet come. She looked at the heavy door that led to the village. She knew that once that door opened, the world she lived in would change forever. She felt a deep sadness for the woman sleeping in the high tower, but she felt a greater fear for herself. Outside the castle walls, the rebellion was a sea of shadows. Thousands of men had gathered in the woods of the valley. They did not carry banners. They did not light great campfires. They sat in the tall grass and waited. Some sharpened their blades with small whetstones. The sound was a rhythmic rasping that blended with the wind. They were farmers, weavers, and former soldiers. They were tired of the taxes. They were tired of the hunger. They believed that the power inside the castle was a ghost of the past. They waited for the moon to reach its peak. The queen shifted slightly in her sleep. A stray lock of dark hair fell across her forehead. She did not know that her captains were currently debating her fate in the guardroom. Sir Kalen, the commander of the personal guard, stood by the fireplace. He looked at the floor. His helmet sat on the table beside him. 2 other officers watched him. They were waiting for him to speak. They were waiting for him to choose a side. Kalen thought of the many years he had stood behind the queen's throne. He thought of the way she looked at the maps of the kingdom with a weary hope. He also thought of his own family in the northern village. He knew their granaries were empty. He picked up his helmet and tucked it under his arm. He walked toward the door without saying a word. His officers followed him. The choice had been made without a single syllable of dialogue. The silence in the queen's chamber grew heavier. The candle on the stand sputtered. The wick was short. The wax had pooled into a flat, transparent lake. The flame struggled to stay upright. It cast a final, bright flash of light across the queen's face before it died out completely. Now, the room was truly dark. Only the faint silver glow of the moon managed to seep through the gaps in the window tapestries. In the hallways, the rebel noblemen began to move toward the royal wing. They moved with more confidence now. They knew the guards would not stop them. They passed the empty stations. They passed the open gates. They climbed the stone steps, their breathing becoming the loudest sound in the castle. The queen remained in her bed. Her isolation was absolute. She was a woman caught between two eras. She was the final breath of a dying dynasty. Her sleep was the last moment of peace the kingdom would know for a very long time. At the threshold of her door, the men stopped. Lord Valerius reached out his hand to the iron latch. He hesitated. He felt the coldness of the metal. He felt the weight of the history behind the oak. He looked back at the men behind him. Their faces were shadows. Their eyes were dark. He pressed the latch down. The mechanism clicked. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the rebellion, it sounded like the cracking of the earth. The door swung inward on its heavy hinges. The cold air from the corridor rushed into the warm room. The queen did not wake. She lay in the center of the bed, a figure of frozen grace. The men entered the room. They stood in a semicircle around her. They did not draw their weapons. They did not move to touch her. They simply stood there and watched her sleep. They were waiting for the sun to rise over the valley. They were waiting for the moment when the woman would wake up and realize that the queen was gone. Beyond the window, the first hint of gray light began to touch the horizon. The woods were quiet. The soldiers in the valley began to stand up. The rebellion had arrived without a single shout. It had unfolded in the spaces between heartbeats. The castle stood dark and formidable against the sky, but its heart had already changed. The queen breathed in. She breathed out. The world continued its slow turn into the morning. The heavy oak door to the royal apartments stood unguarded. The men who previously held the silver-tipped spears had vanished into the kitchens or the lower stables, leaving their posts to the encroaching chill of the galleries. Lord Valerius led the way, his hand trembling slightly as he felt the rough grain of the wood. Behind him, the corridor was a tunnel of flickering orange and deep velvet black. The rebellion had reached the summit of the castle not with a battering ram, but with the quiet cooperation of the weary. Inside the bedchamber, the air remained still. It carried the faint, lingering scent of dried lavender and the metallic tang of a dying hearth. Queen Ilara lay perfectly still, her profile etched in the pale moonlight that filtered through the high, narrow apertures. Her crown sat on a cushioned stool near the wash-basin, a circle of cold gold that no longer held any power over the men standing in her doorway. The gems caught the stray light, glinting like the eyes of a trapped animal, yet the woman herself remained oblivious. The noblemen stepped onto the thick rugs. Their movements suppressed the sound of their boots, creating an eerie, muffled atmosphere. They gathered around the elevated bed, a silent jury in the dark. Valerius looked down at the queen's face. He noted the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, traces of the years spent trying to hold a fracturing realm together with nothing but decrees and debt. A strange sense of mourning filled the room, a collective recognition that an era was ending without a struggle. In the courtyard below, the transition was visible in the change of light. The deep indigo of the night began to dissolve into a bruised purple along the eastern ridges. The thousands of men waiting in the valley had moved closer to the walls. They sat in the tall grass, their presence marked only by the occasional glint of a spearhead in the dawn's first gray light. There was no need for ladders or fire. The gates had been unbolted by a blacksmith who simply wanted to go back to his forge without the burden of a war tax. Ilara's hand moved slightly over the silk coverlet, a subconscious gesture in the depth of her rest. She was dreaming of the northern orchards before the blight, a time of green hills and loud, bustling markets. She did not hear the soft rustle of the parchment Valerius placed on the table next to her crown. The document was an abdication, written in a clear, cold hand, awaiting only a signature that would be forced by the reality of the morning. The first bird of the morning began to sing from a perch on the stone battlement. Its song was sharp and lonely, cutting through the heavy silence of the chamber. The men did not move. They remained as statues, watching the light grow stronger and reveal the dust motes dancing in the air. The weight of the kingdom was shifting. It moved from the sleeping woman to the anxious men, and finally to the thousands waiting outside for the sun to hit the stone. The queen exhaled a long, soft breath. The transition was complete. The morning light crawled across the floorboards, pale and clinical. It illuminated the fine layer of dust on the royal finery and the deep shadows under the eyes of the men standing watch. Lord Valerius did not shift his weight. He remained anchored to the spot, his gaze fixed on the rise and fall of the silk duvet. The silence in the room had become an entity, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a horse's hoof against the earth outside. A floorboard creaked near the doorway. Sir Calin entered, his armor removed, wearing only a dark tunic that made him appear smaller and more human. He carried no weapon. His presence was not a threat but a confirmation of the void where authority once lived. He stood beside Valerius, looking down at the woman who had signed his commissions and honored his house. The betrayal felt less like a strike and more like a slow, inevitable fading of colors. The air in the chamber grew colder as the fire in the hearth finally expired. The last glowing coal turned to gray ash with a soft, settling hiss. Queen Ilara's eyes flickered beneath her lids. The transition from deep sleep to wakefulness was gradual. She did not bolt upright. She did not sense the intrusion immediately. Instead, she let out a small, contented sigh, turning her head toward the window where the sky was now the color of a whetstone. The movement brought her face into the direct path of the morning light. The realization arrived in a wave of stillness. She felt the change in the room's pressure. She felt the heat of human bodies that should not have been there. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The circle of men remained motionless. They did not bow. They did not reach for her. They simply existed in her space, a wall of flesh and silent judgment. Ilara looked at Valerius, then at Calin. She did not find anger in their expressions, she found a profound, weary sadness. Her gaze shifted to the table where her crown sat beside the new parchment. The ink on the page looked black and wet in the dawn. She sat up, pulling the heavy blankets to her chest. The cold air hit her shoulders, but she did not shiver. She looked past the men, through the narrow window at the valley below. The thousands of campfires had gone out, replaced by a dense, living carpet of people moving toward the castle walls. They were not charging. They were walking, a slow and steady tide of brown and gray that filled the horizon. The rebellion was not a storm. It was the sunrise. Ilara reached out a hand toward the parchment. Her fingers were steady, the skin pale against the dark wood of the table. She didn't look for a pen. She didn't look for an escape. She simply touched the corner of the paper, feeling the texture of the fiber. The weight of the castle, the stone, the history, and the hunger seemed to pull at her, drawing her down into the earth. She looked back at Valerius. The old man's eyes filled with tears, but he did not look away. He stood his ground as the representative of a world that could no longer wait for her to lead. The queen took a deep breath of the cold morning air. It tasted of salt and wood smoke. It was the first breath of a woman who was no longer a monarch. She moved her hand from the paper to her crown, pushing the gold circle a few inches away. The metal scraped against the wood, the sharpest sound the room had heard all night. Outside, the first of the townspeople reached the inner courtyard. Their footsteps on the flagstones sounded like falling rain. The descent from the royal apartments involved a long, winding trek down the spiral stone staircase. Ilara walked with a measured pace, her velvet slippers making no sound against the granite. Lord Valerius and Sir Calin followed at a respectful distance, their heavy boots providing a rhythmic percussion to her silent flight. The torches in the wall brackets had burned down to stubs of charred wood, leaving the stairwell in a state of soft, gray gloom. They reached the threshold of the great hall. The vast space, usually filled with the clamor of petitioners and the smell of roasting meats, was cavernous and cold. A thin layer of frost had formed on the interior of the stained glass windows, obscuring the heraldry of her ancestors. Groups of servants stood by the pillars, their hands tucked into their sleeves. They did not move to assist her. They simply watched, their eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and lingering habit. The massive bronze-studded doors of the main gate swung open. The hinges groaned, a sound that echoed across the courtyard and out into the valley. Ilara stepped into the morning air. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of the nearby sea and the damp earth of the orchards. Before her stood the people. They filled the courtyard from the well to the battlements. They stood on the roofs of the stables and perched on the stone walls. There were no shouts. There were no insults. A profound, heavy silence greeted her appearance. The crowd parted as she moved forward. It was a slow, organic movement, like a field of wheat bending before a breeze. She saw the faces of the men who had waited in the woods. Their skin was weathered by the sun and etched with the lines of chronic hunger. Women held small children close to their woolen shawls. All eyes were fixed on her, but the hostility she had expected was absent. In its place was a quiet, collective exhaustion. She reached the center of the courtyard. A single horse stood waiting, a sturdy brown mare with a simple leather saddle. There were no royal trappings. There was no embroidered silk. Ilara stopped and turned to look back at the castle. The stone tower seemed smaller now, less like a fortress and more like a tomb. She saw the new banners, plain, undyed linen, being hoisted onto the ramparts to signal the end of the conflict. Valerius stepped forward and held the stirrup. His movements were stiff, his face a mask of somber duty. Ilara mounted the horse, feeling the warmth of the animal against her legs. She looked down at the old men. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. A silent understanding passed between them. The kingdom was no longer a legacy to be guarded, but a life to be sustained. She turned the mare toward the open gates. The path was clear. The townspeople watched her pass, their expressions unreadable. Some touched their foreheads in a final, fading gesture of respect, others simply turned back to the castle, already looking toward the granaries. Ilara rode through the archway, the shadow of the portcullis falling across her for the last time. The road ahead wound down into the valley, disappearing into a bank of white mist. She did not look back. The weight of the stone had finally lifted, replaced by the vast, cold freedom of the morning. The mist in the valley swallowed the sound of the horse's hooves. Ilara rode toward the foothills, the damp air clinging to her velvet cloak until the fabric felt heavy and sodden. The path grew steeper, turning from packed earth to jagged limestone. To her left, the river rushed over granite boulders, its white foam the only movement in the gray dawn. The castle was now a distant silhouette, a jagged tooth of rock against the lightning sky. High above the timberline, the convent of St. Martha sat nestled in a crevasse of the mountain. Its walls were made of the same unyielding stone as the fortress she had left, but here the masonry was covered in hardy moss and climbing ivy. No guards patrolled the perimeter. The wooden gates stood open, welcoming the morning light into a small courtyard filled with the scent of pine needles and wet earth. An elderly woman in a coarse gray habit waited by the well. She did not bow. She did not offer a royal greeting. She simply took the mare's bridle and gestured toward a low stone doorway. Ilara dismounted, her legs stiff from the climb. Her velvet slippers were ruined, caked with the mud of the mountain trail. She followed the sister into a small cell containing nothing but a narrow cot, a wooden stool, and a ceramic bowl filled with clear water. The room felt incredibly small, yet the air was easier to breathe. Ilara sat on the edge of the cot. The wool was rough against her skin, a sharp contrast to the silk sheets of the royal wing. She looked at her hands, now empty of rings and ink stains. The silence of the mountain was different from the silence of the rebellion. It was not a silence of expectation or fear, but a silence of completion. The responsibility of the crown had been a constant noise in her mind for a decade. Here, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the crags. She washed her face with the cold water, the chill snapping the last remnants of her royal identity away. Through the single window of her cell, she could see the valley floor. The sun had finally broken over the eastern peaks, illuminating the kingdom in a brilliant, uncaring gold. She could see the smoke rising from the village chimneys. Life was continuing. The grain was being distributed. The stone walls were standing. She lay down on the thin mattress and closed her eyes. The stone beneath her felt solid and permanent. For the first time in many years, she was not a queen waiting for a strike, nor a leader weighing the lives of thousands. She was merely a woman in a room of bone-colored stone. The weight of the day settled over her, and as the morning matured into a bright, cold afternoon, she drifted back into a sleep that held no dreams of gold or ash. The stone of the convent cell offered no warmth, yet it provided a profound sense of security. Ilara remained on the narrow cot, her breathing slowing until it matched the rhythmic drip of melting frost from the eaves outside. The transition from the chaos of a collapsing monarchy to the austerity of the mountain was absolute. Every hour that passed pushed the memory of the castle further into a gray, indistinct past. In the valley below, the first full day of the new order unfolded without her. The Great Hall, once a theater of etiquette and hushed power, had become a center of logistics. Lord Valerius sat at the end of a long wooden table, his fingers stained with the ink of 100 new inventories. Beside him, Sir Kalen oversaw the distribution of the northern grain. The townspeople entered through the open bronze doors in a steady stream, their footsteps creating a low, constant murmur that replaced the tension of the previous night. There was a stark, functional beauty in the kingdom's reorganization. The soldiers had traded their pikes for shovels, clearing the mountain passes to allow for late-season trade. The noblemen who had led the rebellion found themselves burdened by the very problems they had criticized, the ledgers remained unbalanced, and the granaries were still finite. They worked in a shared, heavy silence, the reality of governance settling over them like a shroud of lead. At the convent, the sun moved across the lime-washed walls of Ilara's room. The light was sharp and honest. It revealed the cracks in the masonry and the worn edges of the wooden stool. She spent the afternoon walking the small herb garden located in a sheltered nook of the mountain. Her velvet gown, now torn and stained at the hem, brushed against stalks of dried rosemary and lavender. The scent was clean, unburdened by the perfume and sweat of the royal court. The sisters of the order moved through the cloisters with a ghost-like efficiency. They did not look at Ilara with curiosity or pity. To them, she was simply another soul seeking the refuge of the stone. They shared a meal of barley bread and thin vegetable broth in the refectory. The only sound was the clatter of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls. The absence of conversation felt like a physical weight, but it was a weight that Ilara found she could carry. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep, bruised violet. The shadows of the mountain peaks stretched across the valley floor, eventually reaching the distant castle. The fortress looked fragile from this height, a mere collection of toy blocks against the vastness of the landscape. Ilara stood by the perimeter wall, her hands resting on the cold granite. She thought of the document she had touched in her bedroom, the parchment that had ended 1,000 years of lineage. She felt no desire to return. The ambition that had fueled her husband's wars and her own struggle for stability had evaporated. In its place was a quiet, cold clarity. She understood now that the kingdom was not a possession to be held, but a living thing that had simply outgrown its shell. The rebellion had been the final, inevitable shedding of that skin. The bell for evening prayer rang, a single, clear note that vibrated through the mountain air. Ilara followed the sisters into the chapel. The space was small and dark, lit only by a few beeswax candles. There were no golden icons or elaborate tapestries. The walls were bare stone. She sat in the back row, her head bowed. She did not pray for power or restoration. She prayed for the silence to continue. When the service ended, she returned to her cell. The sister had left a small lamp on the stool, its flame a tiny pool of amber in the dark. Ilara lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket to her chin. The night wind began to howl through the crags, a lonely, wild sound that made the interior of the cell feel even safer. The story of the queen was no longer being written in ink or blood. It was being recorded in the steady erosion of the mountain and the slow, rhythmic life of the convent. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness of the high peaks fold over her. The castle was gone. The rebellion was over. The morning would bring the same cold light and the same simple bread. She slept, and for the second night in a row, the world continued its slow, heavy turn without her command. The first snow arrived in the dark of a Tuesday, falling with a silence so absolute it felt as though the mountain had ceased to breathe. By dawn, the convent of St. Martha was encased in a thick, white shroud. The jagged limestone peaks disappeared behind a curtain of falling ice, and the path to the valley was erased. Ilara stood at her narrow window, watching the flakes swirl in the eddies of the wind. The isolation was now physical. The world below, the castle, the council, and the debts, had become a rumor buried under the frost. Life inside the stone walls contracted. The sisters moved with a deliberate, slow grace, their gray habits brushing against the frozen flagstones of the cloister. The daily routine became a series of small, vital acts. There was the rhythmic chopping of firewood in the shed, the sound of the axe echoing sharp and clean against the mountain face. There was the constant tending of the hearth in the refectory, where the smell of burning pine and cedar filled the air. Ilara found her place among the shadows of the library. It was a room smaller than her closet at the castle, filled with scrolls and books that smelled of vellum and old dust. She spent her mornings cleaning the wooden shelves. Her fingers, once accustomed to the smooth chill of royal signet rings, grew calloused and steady. She worked without the need for instruction. She learned the weight of each volume and the way the light hit the desks at midday. In the valley, the winter was a period of harsh reckoning. The new council struggled against the frozen earth. Reports of their difficulties occasionally reached the mountain before the passes fully closed, the grain was being rationed, and the southern lords were bickering over the new laws of the land. Lord Valerius wrote no letters to the convent. Sir Calin sent no messengers. They understood that the woman in the mountains was no longer a player in their game. She had become a part of the landscape. As silent and unmoving as the granite. The cold in the convent was a constant companion. It seeped through the cracks in the masonry and turned the water in the ceramic bowls to solid ice overnight. Ilara learned to appreciate the stark honesty of the temperature. It stripped away the vanity of her previous life. She wore the same coarse wool every day, her velvet gown having been cut into strips to insulate the windows. There was a profound, quiet dignity in the reduction of her needs. During the long evenings, the sisters gathered in the common room to mend the linens. They sat in a circle around the central fire, their needles moving in a hypnotic, synchronized dance. Ilara joined them, her hands learning the patterns of the weave. The flickering firelight cast their shadows onto the walls, making them look like a council of ancient spirits. There was no talk of the rebellion. There was no mention of the fall of Troy or the wars of the north. They spoke of the quality of the wool and the depth of the snow. One night, the wind died down completely. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the roof. Ilara walked out into the courtyard, her breath blooming in the air like a white ghost. The stars were brilliant and cold, pinned to the black velvet of the sky. She looked toward the south, where the castle should have been. She saw nothing but the vast, white emptiness of the peaks. She felt a deep, resonant peace. The rebellion had not stolen her life, it had returned it. The crown had been a barrier between her and the world, a heavy mask that had finally been removed. She was no longer a symbol. She was a woman standing on a mountain, watching the turn of the seasons. As the midwinter moon climbed over the ridge, casting blue shadows across the snow, Ilara returned to her cell. She lay down on the cot, the wool blanket providing a modest, honest warmth. The stone walls protected her. The isolation nourished her. She closed her eyes. The spring thaw began with a series of sharp, cracking sounds that echoed through the ravines like distant thunder. The ice on the eaves melted into a constant, rhythmic dripping, and the first patches of dark, wet earth appeared beneath the pines. With the opening of the mountain passes came the first traveler. He arrived at the convent gate near dusk, his horse lathered in sweat and his cloak caked with the red mud of the lower roads. Sir Calin looked much older than he had on the night Troy fell. The lines on his face had deepened, and his hair was shot through with new streaks of iron gray. He stood in the courtyard, his hand resting heavily on the stone well, waiting for the woman he no longer knew how to address. When Ilara emerged from the herb garden, a basket of young mint in her hand, she did not look like a fugitive. She wore the simple gray habit of the order, her hair tied back with a strip of linen. The greeting was silent. Calin bowed his head, a gesture of muscle memory rather than political necessity. Ilara led him to a stone bench overlooking the valley. The kingdom below was vibrant with the new green of spring, yet even from this distance, the atmosphere felt fractured. Calin spoke of the struggles in the city. The council was paralyzed by indecision. The southern lords had begun to withhold their wool, and the blacksmiths were arguing over the price of iron. The unity that had fueled the rebellion had evaporated once the common enemy was removed. They had the grain, and they had the walls, but they did not have a voice that could command the room without raising its volume. He did not ask her to return. He knew the heavy oak doors of the past were bolted shut. Instead, he asked for a word, a single principle that could bridge the gap between the men who had once been brothers and were now merely rivals. Ilara looked out over the peaks. She thought of the long winter nights and the steady, silent work of the sisters. She thought of how the mountain did not demand the snow to fall or the sun to rise, it simply provided the space for those things to happen. The advice she gave was not a decree. It was a reflection on the nature of the stone. She told him that the strength of the castle was not in the height of the towers, but in the willingness of the stones to lean on one another. If the lords could not find a common goal, they would eventually become a pile of rubble. She suggested that the council stop looking at the ledgers and start looking at the hearths of the people they served. Calin stayed for one night. He slept on a straw mat in the guest quarters, listening to the same mountain silence that had healed the woman he once guarded. In the morning, he mounted his horse. He looked at Ilara one last time, seeing a clarity in her eyes that had never been there when she wore the gold. He rode away down the winding path, a small figure moving through the vast, greening landscape. Ilara watched him until he was a mere speck against the trees. She turned back to her garden, kneeling in the damp earth to plant the summer seeds. The visit had been a ripple on the surface of a deep, still lake. The mountain remained. The air was cool and sweet. The queen who had slept through the rebellion continued her work, her hands stained with the honest soil of a life that was finally her own. The years passed with the slow, inevitable rhythm of the turning seasons. The kingdom in the valley began to stabilize, not through a sudden return to glory, but through a gradual softening of its edges. The council members, guided by the whispered reflections Kaelin brought back from the heights, stopped attempting to rebuild the old empire. Instead, they focused on the village wells, the mountain roads, and the shared granaries. The memory of the queen became a legend, a ghost of the old world whose silence provided the foundation for the new one. At the convent, Ilara's life became a masterpiece of simplicity. Her face, once a mask of regal composure, weathered like the limestone of the peaks. Each wrinkle told a story of a winter survived or a harvest gathered. She became the order's primary librarian, her days spent preserving the knowledge of the past without being burdened by its weight. She repaired the old scrolls, her steady hands moving with a precision that required no crown to command respect. The political turmoil of her youth felt like a play she had watched in a distant theater. The names of the rival lords faded from her mind, replaced by the names of the mountain plants and the specific patterns of the clouds before a storm. She learned that power was a heavy garment, and that true freedom was found in the ability to walk through the world without a shadow. One autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after her departure, Ilara climbed to the highest ridge above the convent. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of the coming ice. From this vantage point, she could see the entire reach of her former realm. The castle was still there, but it no longer looked like a fortress. The gates were permanently open, and the walls were covered in the same creeping ivy that adorned the convent. It had become a place of administration and community rather than a seat of isolation. She saw a group of travelers moving along the river road, their colorful banners reflecting in the water. The trade routes were open. The smoke from the village chimneys rose in straight, peaceful lines. The rebellion had not been an ending, it had been a pruning, allowing the kingdom to grow in a more sustainable, humble direction. Ilara sat on a flat rock and watched the sun dip toward the western horizon. The sky turned a brilliant, fiery orange, silhouetting the jagged teeth of the mountains. She felt no regret. She felt no desire to be down there, among the ledgers and the debates. Her heart was in the stone, the wind, and the quiet repetition of the monastic hours. As the first star appeared in the darkening east, she stood up and began the descent back to her cell. Her movements were slow but sure. She was a woman who had found her center in the silence. The queen who had slept through the rebellion had finally woken up to a life that was quiet, honest, and entirely her own. The bell for evening prayer rang, its lone voice carrying across the silent peaks. Ilara followed the sound home. The castle stood upon a ridge of dark stone, watching over the valley below. Its towers rose against a pale winter sky. The banners along its walls moved slowly in the cold wind. Torches burned in iron brackets beside the gates. Their flames flickered but did not waver. Night had settled early. Frost gathered along the edges of the parapets. The air carried the scent of smoke and damp earth. Far beyond the walls, the fields lay quiet beneath a thin veil of mist. Inside, the great hall had long since fallen silent. The hearth embers glowed faintly. Tapestries hung heavy against the stone. The long tables stood empty, their surfaces polished and bare. High above the courtyard, within the royal chamber, the queen rested. Her chamber was large but severe. The walls were built of thick stone, softened only by woven hangings stitched with faded gold thread. A tall window overlooked the valley. Its shutters were drawn against the night. A single taper burned near the bedside, casting a steady circle of light. The queen lay beneath layers of wool and linen. Her red hair, once bright as copper in sunlight, was now braided loosely against the pillow. Her crown rested upon a carved oak table nearby. The jewels reflected the candlelight in quiet colors of green and red. She had retired earlier than usual. The court had felt strained for weeks. Letters had arrived bearing seals from distant lords. Supplies had moved slowly along the roads. Taxes had gone unpaid in certain provinces. None of it had seemed urgent at first, Small matters often rose and faded without consequence. But this winter carried a different weight. Beyond the outer villages, murmurs had begun. Farmers gathered in barns at night. Minor nobles traveled without proper escort. Messengers changed direction before reaching the castle gates. Still, within her chamber, the queen slept. Her breathing was slow and even. Her face showed neither fear nor peace. It held the stillness of habit. She had ruled for many years. She had known war in her youth and betrayal in her middle age. Weariness had become familiar. Below her chamber, in the long eastern corridor, movement stirred. Two noblemen walked side by side along the narrow passage. Their boots made little sound against the worn stone. Each carried a small lantern, its light shielded by metal plates. They did not look at one another. Their cloaks were dark and heavy. They paused near an archway where a guard stood watch. The guard was young. His beard had only recently grown thick. His hand rested upon the hilt of his sword, though his grip was uncertain. He had heard rumors from the kitchens. He had seen unfamiliar riders at the gates. He had noticed the tension in the steward's face. The noblemen inclined their heads slightly as they passed. The guard did not stop them. Further down, in a chamber once used for council meetings, three figures waited. A map of the kingdom lay spread across a wide table. Small wooden markers had been placed upon several towns. One by one, additional lords entered. Their faces were pale from the cold. Their eyes were restless. None spoke loudly. Their movements were measured and careful. The rebellion had not yet begun. It breathed quietly, like embers beneath ash. Outside the castle walls, beyond the frozen moat, riders gathered in the dark fields. Their horses stamped against the frost. Leather creaked softly. The men wore no banners. They carried no bright colors. They waited for a signal that had not yet been given. Within her chamber, the queen turned slightly in her sleep. Her dreams were without form. They were neither pleasant nor troubled. They drifted through memories of corridors, ceremonies, and long councils that had stretched past midnight. She felt again the weight of velvet sleeves and iron decisions. She had ruled alone for many years. There had been advisors, generals, bishops, and cousins. Many had served faithfully. Others had vanished quietly from court. Some had died in distant lands. Trust had grown thin with time. Earlier that evening she had read a letter from a northern lord. The parchment had trembled faintly in her hands. The words had been respectful. The meaning beneath them had not. She had folded the letter carefully and placed it among others in a locked chest. Now the chest remained closed beside her bed. In the kitchens below, servants whispered while scraping the last of the pots. They had heard that certain gates would not be barred tonight. They had noticed that extra torches had been prepared but not lit. Fear moved through them like a draft beneath a door. The captain of the guard stood alone in the courtyard. Frost gathered upon his shoulders. He studied the walls and the towers above. He had sworn loyalty many years before. He had fought in the Queen's name. But loyalty had become complicated. Several of his men had kin in the outer provinces. They had received letters speaking of hunger and resentment. They had heard sermons hinting that the realm required renewal. He looked toward the Queen's darkened window. No light showed there. In the eastern tower, a bell rope had been cut earlier that evening. The severed end lay coiled beneath a wooden stair. It had been done cleanly, with a sharp blade. No one had yet noticed. The rebellion was careful. It did not rush. Back in the council chamber, the gathered lords studied the map. Their lands had suffered under recent levies. Trade routes had been restricted. The Queen's insistence on central authority had weakened ancient privileges. Each man carried his own grievance. Together they formed a quiet storm. One lord pressed a wooden marker forward across the map. It rested beside the castle symbol. Another nodded once. They had not yet committed their forces. They waited for assurance from within the walls. They required confirmation that the gates would open without resistance. The young guard in the eastern corridor shifted his stance. His thoughts were restless. He imagined his father's farm far to the south. He remembered seasons of poor harvest. He wondered where his loyalty truly lay. Footsteps approached again. A steward passed by, carrying a bundle of sealed letters. His expression was fixed. He did not glance at the guard. In the Queen's chamber, the candle burned lower. A faint draft entered beneath the shutters. The flame bent slightly but did not go out. The room held its silence. The Queen's hand rested upon the coverlet. A ring with a large red stone caught the light. It had belonged to her mother. It had survived wars and imprisonment. Her rule had begun in uncertainty. She had inherited a fractured kingdom. She had strengthened the crown. She had imposed order where chaos once stood. But order had required pressure. The rebellion was not born in a single night. It had grown slowly over years. Each decree had shaped it. Each alliance had fed it. In the stables, a stable hand slipped through a side door. He carried a folded scrap of parchment hidden within his sleeve. He moved toward the outer fields, where riders waited in shadow. Above him, the castle loomed unaware. The captain of the guard finally turned from the courtyard. He walked toward the inner gatehouse. His steps were heavy but steady. 2 of his most trusted men followed him. They did not speak. In the council chamber, a decision settled like dust upon stone. A single torch was lifted high in the eastern tower. Outside the walls, watchers saw its glow through a narrow window. The riders straightened in their saddles. Inside her chamber, the Queen remained asleep. The torch in the tower flickered once, then twice. In the courtyard below, the captain reached the gatehouse doors. He placed his hand upon the iron lever that controlled the inner portcullis. For a moment, he hesitated. Years of service weighed upon him. Battles fought. Orders obeyed. Oaths sworn before altar and crown. Then he lowered the lever. Chains groaned softly. The inner gate began to rise. The rebellion moved from shadow into action. Yet in the quiet chamber above, beneath layers of wool and linen, the Queen continued to sleep. Her face remained still. The candle beside her guttered low. The night deepened around the castle. And the kingdom shifted. The inner gate rose slowly, iron teeth lifting from stone with a muted groan. The sound carried through the gatehouse but did not echo far. The mechanism had been oiled earlier that day. No one had questioned the care taken. Cold air swept inward as the opening widened. Outside the walls, the waiting riders urged their horses forward at a measured pace. Hooves crossed the frozen ground without haste. They did not shout. They did not raise steel. They moved like men entering a chapel. The captain of the guard stepped aside. His face showed neither relief nor regret. He watched the riders pass beneath the archway. Some he recognized. Minor lords from nearby estates. Sons of families once loyal to the crown. Men who had stood beside him in past campaigns. Their eyes did not linger on him. Above, torches along the battlements burned steadily. A few guards observed the movement below. Some tightened their grips upon their spears. Others looked away. In the eastern corridor, the young guard heard the faint disturbance. A change in the air. A tremor through the stone beneath his boots. He straightened and listened. Footsteps approached from the far end. One of the noblemen from the council chamber walked toward him. His cloak brushed the wall as he passed. There was a calm certainty in his stride now. The young guard felt the weight of decision press upon him. He stepped back from the archway and allowed the nobleman to continue without challenge. In the courtyard, more riders entered. They dismounted quickly and handed their reins to stable hands who had been waiting in shadow. Armor shifted softly. Swords remained sheathed. This was not a siege. It was a turning. Within the castle, doors were opened with quiet hands. Servants were instructed to remain in their quarters. No bells were rung. No alarms were sounded. In the Queen's chamber, the candle finally burned down to a thin thread of wax. The flame trembled, flared briefly, then faded into darkness. Moonlight pressed faintly against the shutters. The Queen shifted once more in her sleep. Her brow tightened for a moment, as though some distant sensation brushed her thoughts. Then her face returned to stillness. Below her, the rebellion spread through the lower halls. In the armory, a small group of men removed certain weapons from their racks. They worked carefully, selecting blades that had once belonged to their own houses. Shields bearing the royal crest were left behind. In the chapel, a priest knelt alone before the altar. He had been informed of the plan earlier that evening. His hands were clasped tightly together. He prayed without sound. The rebellion was not fueled by hatred alone. It was carried by exhaustion. Years of strict command had hardened the kingdom. Trade had been controlled. Noble privileges reduced. The crown's authority had grown firm and unyielding. Some had admired her strength. Others had endured it. In a chamber near the western tower, a group of senior lords gathered once more. Their cloaks had been removed. Their expressions were pale but resolved. A parchment lay upon the table before them. It bore a prepared declaration. The words were formal and measured. They spoke of restoration, of balance, of duty to the realm. No one wished for blood. One lord pressed his signet ring into warm wax. The seal settled firmly. Others followed. In the corridors, guards were approached quietly and asked to stand aside. Many did so without resistance. A few removed their helmets and placed them upon benches. None raised a blade against the others. The castle changed hands with the softness of falling snow. Outside the walls, villagers who had followed at a distance waited anxiously. They could see movement upon the towers but heard no clash of steel. The night remained strangely calm. Inside her chamber, the queen slept on. Her dreams shifted slightly. Shapes moved without meaning. A distant memory surfaced of her coronation day. The weight of the crown upon her head. The solemn faces in the cathedral. The promise she had made to protect the realm at any cost. She had kept that promise in her own way. Footsteps began to ascend the spiral stair leading toward her chambers. 3 figures climbed carefully. They carried no torches, relying instead upon small covered lanterns. The stone steps were narrow. The air grew colder as they rose. At the landing outside her chamber door, they paused. 2 guards had stood watch there earlier in the evening. Now the corridor was empty. The guards had been reassigned to distant posts under quiet instruction. The heavy wooden door stood closed. One of the lords stepped forward and placed his hand upon the iron latch. For a long moment, he did not move it. He had served her faithfully once. He had admired her resolve. He had defended her decrees in council. But time had altered his loyalty. The kingdom's balance had shifted. He believed now that the realm required change more than obedience. He lifted the latch slowly. The door opened with only a faint sound. The chamber beyond lay in darkness. Pale moonlight traced the outlines of furniture and tapestry. The queen's bed stood near the center of the room, its curtains partially drawn. She remained motionless beneath the covers. The men entered quietly and closed the door behind them. They did not approach her immediately. They stood together near the foot of the bed, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. The silence within the chamber felt heavier than any battlefield. One of the men stepped forward at last. He studied her face in the dim light. The lines of age were visible now. The sharpness that had defined her rule remained even in sleep. She looked smaller than she had upon the throne. The Lord felt a brief stirring of doubt. He had expected resistance. He had prepared himself for confrontation. Instead he found a woman at rest. Below the chamber, the castle had fully yielded. Gates were secured under new command. Messengers were dispatched toward neighboring provinces, carrying news of the transition. No blood had been shed. The rebellion had unfolded like a shadow crossing stone. In the courtyard, the captain of the guard removed his gloves and exhaled slowly. Frost clung to his beard. He understood that history had turned in quiet fashion this night. Above him, within the chamber, the queen's breathing changed slightly. Her eyes fluttered once beneath closed lids. A presence in the room disturbed the edge of her sleep. Not fear, but awareness. Slowly, without sudden movement, her eyes opened. Moonlight reflected faintly within them. She did not start. She did not cry out. She looked toward the figures standing before her bed and understood. Years of rule had taught her to read silence. She remained lying against her pillows. Her hands rested calmly upon the coverlet. The men did not kneel. The chamber held no raised voices, no drawn swords, no hurried gestures. Only the cold air, the fading night, and the weight of decision. Beyond the castle walls, the eastern horizon began to pale with the first hint of dawn. And the queen, fully awake now, lay still as the rebellion completed its quiet work. Dawn approached slowly. A pale gray light pressed against the shutters of the royal chamber. The air inside remained cold. The fire in the hearth had long since faded to ash. The stone walls held the night within them. The queen did not rise from her bed. She lay propped against her pillows, her red hair loosened over her shoulders. Her eyes were open and clear. There was no confusion in them. No haste. The men standing before her waited. They had expected anger. They had prepared for resistance. Instead they found stillness. The oldest among them stepped forward and bowed his head slightly. It was not a deep bow, but it was not careless. Habit remained even in defiance. The queen studied his face. She had known him since his youth. She had granted him lands after his father's death. She had entrusted him with troops during a northern campaign. She remembered the oath he had sworn in the great hall. Time had changed them both. She sat upright at last. The movement was unhurried. The linen sheets fell neatly around her. She drew a heavy robe around her shoulders and tied it firmly. Outside the chamber, the corridor filled with soft movement. Word had begun to spread among the remaining servants. Some wept quietly. Others watched in silence. None attempted to interfere. The castle felt different now. Not broken. Not damaged. Simply altered. In the courtyard below, new guards stood at the gates. They wore familiar armor but bore different expressions. The captain remained near the archway, overseeing the change of watch. His posture was straight, though his eyes were tired. The queen rose from her bed and crossed the chamber floor. Her bare feet touched the cold stone without hesitation. She moved toward the tall window and pushed the shutters open. Morning light entered slowly. Mist hung low across the valley. Frost covered the fields beyond the walls. The world outside appeared unchanged. She rested her hands upon the stone sill and looked outward. For many years she had watched the same horizon. She had measured seasons by that view. She had considered war and peace while standing at that very window. Behind her, the lords remained silent. They did not rush her. They understood that this moment belonged to her. The rebellion had been careful. It had avoided blood. It had avoided spectacle. It had aimed not to destroy, but to replace. The queen knew this. She had sensed the shift long before this night. Letters had grown cautious. Counsels had grown shorter. Smiles at court had grown thin. Authority can endure only so long as it is believed necessary. She turned from the window. The crown still rested upon the oak table where she had left it. The jewels caught the growing daylight. For years it had symbolized unity. For others, it had come to represent constraint. She approached the table and lifted the crown in both hands. It was heavier than memory allowed. The men watched as she studied it for a long moment. There was no trembling in her fingers. No outward sign of regret. She set the crown back down upon the table with care. In the courtyard, villagers who had gathered beyond the outer walls began to disperse. Word traveled quickly along the roads. The realm would awaken to a different order. Inside the castle, clerks prepared new seals. Messengers readied horses. The declaration signed during the night was copied carefully by steady hands. In the chapel, the priest rose from his knees. He moved toward the door and stepped into the morning light. The queen returned to the center of her chamber. She did not plead. She did not accuse. Her face carried the same stern lines it had held for years. Yet something within her had shifted. The burden she had carried alone had lifted without ceremony. Power rarely leaves with noise when it has been long expected. The lords stepped forward as one. They bowed again, deeper this time. Respect remained, even as authority passed. The queen inclined her head slightly in return. Servants entered to assist her with dressing. Their hands shook at first, but steadied under her calm gaze. The red and gold gown was fastened carefully, the high white collar arranged with precision. Her appearance remained regal. When she was fully dressed, she moved toward the door. The corridor beyond seemed longer than before. Torches burned low along the walls. Faces watched from doorways and shadows. She walked without escort. The lords followed at a respectful distance. Together they descended the spiral stair. Each step echoed faintly in the narrow tower. The sound carried downward through the stone. In the great hall, the new assembly waited. Nobles stood in ordered rows. Guards lined the walls. The hearth had been relit, and a thin stream of smoke rose toward the rafters. The throne stood at the far end of the hall. High-backed and carved with ancient symbols. It had witnessed many rulers before her. She paused before it. For years she had taken her seat there each morning. She had issued commands from that height. She had judged disputes and shaped policy beneath its carved canopy. Now she stood before it as a figure stepping away from shadow into light. She did not sit. Instead, she turned slowly to face the gathered assembly. Her gaze moved across familiar faces. Some showed relief. Others showed uncertainty. A few revealed quiet sorrow. The realm had changed without clash or fire. A new leader stepped forward from among the lords. Younger, though not inexperienced. His bearing was firm but not harsh. He bowed deeply before her. The queen regarded him for a long moment. There was no need for ceremony beyond this. She stepped aside from the throne. The movement was simple. Unforced. Final. The young lord approached and took his place before the seat of rule. He did not sit immediately. He allowed the moment to settle across the hall. Outside, sunlight broke fully over the valley. Frost began to melt along the castle walls. The banners stirred gently in the morning breeze. The queen remained standing at the side of the hall. No longer at its center. Years of command had ended in quiet transition. No swords drawn. No cries raised. Only the steady turning of time. As the morning advanced, the castle resumed its rhythm. Servants carried water through the corridors. Bakers prepared bread. Horses were saddled for distant roads. Life continued. The queen was escorted not to a cell, but to a smaller chamber overlooking the southern gardens. It had once belonged to a visiting duchess many winters ago. It was modest, though comfortable. She entered without resistance. The door closed softly behind her. Outside the window, bare branches swayed against the pale sky. The gardens lay dormant beneath winter frost. She removed her gloves and placed them neatly upon a wooden table. The castle no longer belonged to her. Yet the stones still remembered her footsteps. The rebellion had not shattered the kingdom. It had simply moved it forward. And within the quiet of her new chamber, the former queen stood alone, listening to the distant sounds of a realm adjusting to its altered fate.